I was not able to easily. So that, for clarity, I think that would help. I was interested that the analysis wasn't done by water year type. That caught my attention. And the last part is the notion that this is a big optimization problem, in a sense. And it's a challenging one because it's become stepwise. And when you're doing optimization, as soon as you freeze the previous step, you've lost some ability to optimize the solution in a conceptual way, not in a dynamic programming or linear programming way. And so I think that's something to consider about looking at flow effects on fish and then taking those and moving them the next step and reiterating and all that. Because in my mind, it's a big optimization question. And it may not be as tractable as it could be if you deal with the problem all at once from an academic point of view. Practically, that's hard. And I guess the last comment is I'm very surprised by the degradation in trust among the various people and parties involved in the Delta. And I'm afraid that the people issues may override most of the science issues. And I'm just kind of a plea, perhaps not to the board, but to people. Respect other people, and if you go to the next slide real quick, we might as well do it. There's stuff to be learned from us. We're all learners in this, so we're students. And people go through 5 hours of learning knowledge that disagrees with what they think is right, or long-held opinions. And this comes from actually museum science studies and curriculum theory. If people understand that people are going through these 5 steps in different order and spending different amounts of time at that, it may help a little bit in the people part of the process, and there are other theories as well. But otherwise, if you notice, there's no arrow that gets you out of this. And with that, I'll stop. It's a little bit out of left field, I admit. But
No, I did that to you.
One other question, and anyone can answer if you got the answer. Phase 4, as you saw on the introduction, is on looking at all the major tributary rivers to the Delta, not just the Sac, not just the San Joaquin, but really all of the tributaries into those systems and elsewhere. Who's looking at that? I mean, I hear YOLO bypass. Yeah, I've heard that like a lot. What about other rivers that can contribute this kind of effort? Because in my opinion, that's where we've got got more option. We have more options and perhaps than. But you tell me. Ted? Peter?
All right. I think you're going to be hearing more later about BDCP and some other programs that are out there to look at a whole range of different projects. Things range from really big ideas like YOLO bypass to pretty small and focused ones, even small tributaries. Pewter Creek, Cache Creek, other smaller areas actually have tremendous potential for restoration. It's really a matter of time.
Can I just, in the original, one of the original presentations, you talked a bit about predation, and we always see the picture of a largemouth bass with a little guy in there just before the end. It always reminds me of Jonah or something. I'm surprised you didn't talk more about the science or studies on predation. Is there much? It just seems like it's weirdly silent in this conversation, though many people throw it around. I was hoping to get a little more insight on it from you guys. It may be that we hear about it. I'm sure we're going to hear about it a lot all day, but I just was curious if any of you have any, and you can make individual comments about the role of predation and what we should be doing to understand it a little bit better, where it is, what we can do about it.
I'll chime in on that one if that's okay. I think everybody recognizes that predation's a significant problem, particularly for, I mean, basically when we see poor survival of juvenile salmonids in the Delta, most of us think that is related to predation, interacting, of course, with poor habitat and poor food and other factors. I would suggest that studies of it sort of need to be related to what do we do about it, because we can do lots of studies documenting it's happening, but that doesn't help us solve the problem. And in that regard, we haven't done enough. Some of my colleagues did an experiment a couple of years ago on the McCollum River, which was actually referenced in our submittal, where we manipulated predators by removing them with electrofishing and combined that with a flow experiment and got some kind of mixed results. It sort of worked, it sort of didn't. But I think we need more of those kinds of experiments evaluating management actions in an effort to minimize predation effects. And it doesn't just have to be predator removal, it can be habitat enhancements to get fish out of the vulnerable areas.
Anyone else? Are there just, these studies aren't happening
I
for some reason?
just want to point out that Fish and Game, working with others, is planning a workshop on predation next spring, and we're helping to develop that. But there will be information coming out of that workshop sometime in the next few months.
Spring.
I might chime in as well. I guess I agree with Brad that predation is the major source of mortality for fish going through the Delta. It's a natural part of any ecosystem. It's the major way fish die. They're not starving to death. If they start to starve to death, they get eaten. Contaminants may affect them, but once you get weakened, you get eaten. And I agree the idea is trying now to figure out where predation is an issue. Where is it unusually high and why? And I think in the presentation I gave to the board in the previous workshop, I tried to highlight some of the new tools we're using to understand this. So first, genetic tools to look at fish consumption of different species. When you look in a fish gut, you just see mush, but the genetic tools allow us to see who's eating what. The second main area is progress in modeling, and Kenny worked a fair bit on this with us and with UC Davis, trying to model what the consumption is. But really what we need to get to is finer scale studies to look at specific locations of studies. And one of the best examples I've seen is from National Marine Fisheries Service. Some of Eric's colleagues are doing great work along the Sacramento corridor, doing camera work and telemetry of predators in that area, trying to see where they're congregating.
Yeah, this is just an area where there's a lot of is so, is not out in the ecosystem of the issue, to go back to Kenny's issue about people, and I'm just surprised there's a need for studies, whether it's the applied, try it and see if it works or not. Just that coming back into this level of granularity on this, it surprises me that there hasn't been more. Since there's so much discussion of it, I'm surprised that there's not more actually experiments that people have been trying to do over the past, well, I've been gone, what, over 10 years, and this was an issue then. So I don't understand why that hasn't been done, but I'm glad you're pulling together the workshop, but it's something we need to know about and start experimenting on so that we can get past the dinner party level of discourse about whether it is or whether it's not.
Rich, because of my lack of discipline, we should have started the next panel 15 minutes ago. And I don't know about everybody else, but I need to take a break for a couple of minutes. Let's take this 10-minute break in 5, and we'll resume at 10 after. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Would all of you on the next panel come up so we're prepared to go, or my 5 minutes is going to turn into 10?
Now, they do have a full 7 minutes of presentation.
Okay. The next panel, if you'd come up, please. And even though my colleagues aren't here, if you would all take a seat, please.
We'd like to get the next panel seated, please.
Please, those of you on the next panel, come up.
Did you call us?
Well, kind of. I was trying. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take your seats, please, I would really appreciate it. Is this microphone turned off, or is somebody just ignoring me? Yeah. Folks, if you don't sit down, we're not going to get done, please.
Gavel. Use your gavel.
Oh, that's right.
Don't break it.
Come on.
Put the microphone next to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd appreciate the courtesy of having you sit down and be quiet, please. I've asked 3 times now. I'm getting tired of it. Who is leading off for the next panel?
I'm sorry, did you ask who's leading it? Okay, that'll be me. I'm going to
Just get
introduce
going, Aaron.
everyone.
Maybe they'll
Okay.
be quiet and sit down.
I will take this opportunity to get started. So thank you, Chairman Hoppin, and members of the board for inviting us here today to participate in the panel. This is the Fishery Agencies and Regulatory Agency panel. And I'm going to quickly introduce everyone so we can get going. I'll start way down at the other end with Garwin Yip. He's the Water Operations and Delta Consultations Supervisor at the National Marine Fisheries Service. Then next is Roger Ganay. He is the Assistant Field Supervisor and Fish Biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next to him is Pat Brandis. She's also a Fisheries Biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Matt Nobriga, who is also a Fisheries Biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Then Pat Colston, who is an environmental scientist with California Department of Fish and Game, and Kevin Schaefer, who is, anadromous fisheries manager at CDFG. And my name is Erin Forsman. I'm an environmental scientist at US EPA on the Bay Delta team. And to my left is Bruce Herbold, who is our fisheries biologist at US EPA. So just a few quick words before we get started. I just wanted to let you know that we work together to produce this presentation, but each agency is presenting their own slides that's consistent with their expertise and agency responsibilities and roles. And CDFG is going to get us started, followed by Fish and Wildlife Service, then National Marine Fisheries Service, and EPA will go last.
And before you all begin, I will remind you all that these are very poor microphones, so please center up on them or we're not going to be able to hear what you have to say, and we want to do that. And if you don't hit the green button, we're going to be able to hear what you're uttering under your breath. Are you it, Bruce?
I was just going to comment, you might speak more into the microphone when you say that.
If you want to talk, you better start. Sir.
Good morning, everyone. This is Kevin Schaefer, Department of Fish and Game. I was going to start the group's slides. We are telling somewhat of a story, and that's one reason I'm going first. I'll speak to the anadromous species, including the salmon, steelhead, and sturgeons. Pat will speak to the two smelt species. Some of the things that you'll hear will be emphasized by our sister agencies as we go along. My specific comments and slides have to do with our written material, though there are a couple of things that came up during the science panel that when I get to the end, I'll try to give you some input in which you asked about. I think it's important to realize, to look at this, what we would call the species at risk within the larger delta system. And to think about them as individuals, but also as a community. I think one of the emphases of our recommendation to the board is to think of the aquatic community as well as the riparian community when you look at your responsibilities for water management. So most of the animals on the slide you see are listed under the state and or Federal Endangered Species Act, meaning they needed that level of protection. However, for Fish and Game, it's as equally important to talk about fishes that aren't on that list and are part of the fisheries community, in this case specifically fall run and late fall Chinook salmon, as well as white sturgeon, which still are a fisheries component for California. This is the key points for our narrative. We're emphasizing that what you have been dealing with since 2006, and as far as implementing, as well as the doubling goals are still significant towards the salmon objective. We also believe that the operation of the cross-channel gates has significant value both to juvenile and adult life stages of salmonids. We believe that there are some upstream issues that are becoming more clear to us and to the greater fisheries and resource community that we wish to speak to. And then I will end with some of the complexities of what we all call adaptive management, and specifically with regard to climate change and what it may mean to aquatic and riparian systems. I think there is some information, it may or may not be ironic at this point in time, but there's some key information that's going to be available now to the board and into the future that we haven't had in the past. Last year was the first report, but the state will annually be doing a constant fractional mark report on what we know about hatchery origin fall run Chinook salmon out of the Central Valley, and where those fish are going, whether they're caught on the ocean, whether they're caught in the river, or where they show up on natural spawning grounds or back at a hatchery. And that's key information that we haven't had. The program began in 2007, but the first full report over a whole cohort of Chinook salmon out of the hatcheries is now available, and we are currently working on the second year's report now, and that will be presented at the Delta Science Conference coming up soon. We also have 2 comprehensive monitoring plans for the Central Valley now, which we didn't have just a couple of years ago. One for Chinook salmon and one for steelhead. They were developed by interagency groups with independent scientists, consultant scientists, federal and state agencies, the academic community. They're based on the most modern methodologies that we know, and this is to have a comprehensive view of the species in the valley as well as the watershed-specific populations. And they're, okay. And I'll speak at the end but I'll tell you that we have the federal scientific report on the anadromous hatcheries in California, both the Klamath and Trinity, but for the facilities that are in the Central Valley. And there are not only the 110-page report as to scientific recommendations, but there's over 2,200 pages of summaries. It's the most comprehensive summary of what we know about the hatcheries in California, again, specifically the Central Valley. And then maybe most importantly is that the federal government, NOAA Fisheries, is finalizing their recovery plan for the federally listed anadromous species in the Central Valley, winter run and spring run Chinook salmon and steelhead. Though we, DFG, is a co-manager of that report. 2 of those species are state listed, and that's going to be a foundation for recovering species so they don't deserve the protection listing, so there's sustained populations. And those recommendations will be something that we will seriously take, and we think that the board should look at. Again, they're watershed specific, they're Central Valley wide. Those are going to have important components to recovering those stocks. We want to show you just a couple of the graphs that are in our report regarding the current state of tracking the status of the listed salmonids. You've probably seen them before, but we think it's worth emphasizing that if you look at this graph, and we'll show you 2, we're going to show you fall run and winter run. but late fall run and steelhead and spring run are also in our written summary to you. It's important to note that when you look at the doubling goal through the Central Valley Program Improvement Act or the state statute to establish a salmon trout anadromous program to basically bring up naturally spawning sustainable stocks, we haven't achieved that. California has not achieved that. And so if you look to the left of the graph, you'll see where the baseline is. And if you look at the doubling goal, that's a dotted line. And you can see that, like most anadromous species, there's variability. But the goal of improving naturally spawning sustainable stocks has not occurred. And so part of that, part of the control that the board has as to looking at the dynamics of, and it is dynamics, the dynamics of water management. You've heard that it's not just flow. And you'll see when I get to the last slides how flow is a factor. The volume of water and the rate of which the water is coming are important to anadromous species, but there are a lot of complexities to that. But bottom line, the goal of what we're trying to achieve for anadromous fishes has not occurred. This is the winter run, and this is most obvious, but this also demonstrates why this particular run is protected under both the state and the federal act. Its status is not good, and its trend is not good. Cross-channel gates have become an important consideration for, I guess, what has been talked this morning about applied science or active management, field management, in closing the gates and using pulse flows. What we have learned over the last few years is that anadromous species respond positively to both, and when done in conjunction together, you get increased response. We see less straying. We see animals in the Sacramento system staying in the Sacramento system. We see McCullumney fish going back to McCullumney, American river fish going back to American, and we're seeing greater survival of juveniles. So an important point that the department wants to make to you is that the cross-channel gates are an important management factor for anadromous species. Now we get into some of the complexities of upstream and also all the way out to the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. And you've heard from the scientists this morning. We've made three major points dealing with anadromous salmonids, is that red dewatering upstream is an issue which is affected by water management in the system. Restoration of floodplain habitat is an essential aspect to not only the current life history strategies that we're seeing in the Sacramento and San Joaquin systems, but to increasing variability for all the life stage history strategies as the animals are moving out or coming in. It's important for juveniles, not only for, you've heard issues about staying away from predators or for growth, but also for giving different times of year, especially Chinook salmon, different alternatives for what their life history strategy might be immigrating out to the bay. The other issue that you've heard about is that we believe also that riparian habitat is a key feature that is lacking currently in the system, not just the Sacramento Basin, but into the Delta and out to Sassoon Marsh. Riparian habitat is a key factor to overall salmon ecology. These are recent photographs this season of red dewatering in the Sacramento River below Kenswood Dam. We basically tag the reds, and then over time during, as the water is ramped down, we look to see if reds are actually being completely dewatered, or in some of these complexes, if the top reds of the complex are suffering from some level of dewatering. And last year, if you combine those three categories of dewatering, we saw almost 23% of the reds dewatered. It's a factor not only of which rate you ramp down, but the difference between the high flow and the low flow. If you allow the animals to move into these suitable habitats, both for spawning and for rearing, because you've heard about riverbank spawning and rearing, if you allow them to do that and draw the water down quickly, you can actually trap animals. If you draw it down during the entire season, the total difference between where you started and where you ended, you ultimately dewater some percentage of the reds. So it's not only the rate of which water is brought down, but it's the total difference in what percentage impact you may or may not have on the spawning adults, and thus the eggs, the juveniles. I wanted to take the liberty to also remind you that I think there's growing attention and appreciation for the significance of sturgeon in California, specifically in the Central Valley. Green and white sturgeon and their occupation in the valley have, just like salmon and steelhead, have consequences up and down the entire Pacific coast. So when green sturgeon was listed by NOAA Fisheries, one of the considerations was what kind of impact was the sturgeon population or the dropping sturgeon population in the Central Valley having as far as Washington. White sturgeon are still an important fishery in the Central Valley. And if you know sturgeon fishermen, you know that they are as passionate, if not more passionate, than salmon or striped bass fishermen. So we are looking at them, we are monitoring them more, we are working with our sister agencies using things like dual sonar to track them and try to find out where both they stay during warm events, as well as if they're spawning in places we didn't think. So DFG wanted to bring to your attention the significance of sturgeon as well as an anadromous species, as well as salmon and steelhead. Adaptive management. I think the important point I want to make here is adaptive management has to be based on data that is collected and analysis that is done with that collection. You've heard from Brad Cavallo and Ted Summers how we're starting to be more informed by the data that we are gathering. And I'm here to tell you that California is situated in a position that we haven't been in the last 10 years, or the other terms of your board. We are now able to collect comprehensive, scientifically valid information on the anadromous salmonids to be able to provide to organizations like yours and others to make informed decisions. On the issue of climate change, I think it's important to note that riparian and aquatic systems are the first systems that are affected by climate change, but they're also the two systems that will allow human community, as well as the wildlife community, to respond to climate change. So healthy aquatic environments, healthy floodplains, healthy riparian forests and buffers are what are going to allow both humans and fishes to be able to deal with potentially increased winter storm events and quick snow melts, as well as warmer and drier summers. Those are the systems that will provide conditions for salmon and sturgeon in the short term and potentially in the long term.
Kevin, I would assume that if we do something that requests the closure of the gates, you mentioned you'll come to us with an MOU between all the fishery agencies saying that's a good idea?
Well, it's currently an operational option, and one of the things we're suggesting is if you look at the materials we provided, looking at the 10-day closure with the pulse flow and the kind of survival we saw and the lack of stray, and so one of the suggestions we're making directly is to for that October experiment, to expand that to 14 days.
On your hatchery study, are you evaluating the ocean catch, the capture in the ocean in your review?
Yes,
of hatcheries?
And the report is available. The constant fractional mark report is available that shows you the percentage of hatchery from each hatchery. Each individual hatchery in Central Valley, their contribution to ocean recreational and commercial. One of the comments I wanted to make that wasn't in my presentation is on the scientific hatchery review of California. There is a policy team, an interagency policy team, which will come back together to implement, to start making changes or at least evaluating changes at all the facilities, as well as the department has already had both our fisheries managers and our hatchery operators and their supervisors look at the report. So we've already initiated some changes at Central Valley facilities, and we plan on continuing that into the indefinite future. Part of it will be the complexity of them, but the things we can make to improve the scientific and integrity now, and also to minimize the effects of hatchery stock on naturally spawning stock, we're starting to look at those and make some of those changes now.
But will you also be looking at, setting quotas, if you will, for ocean capture as well for its
well, if you
effect?
know about how we manage the ocean, the ocean management of both recreation and commercial is a multi-state, multi-agency, multi-tribal decision. But yes, all of this information now will be taken to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council to help us help them make decisions about ocean harvest rates and et cetera.
Good morning. I wanted to say that I thought you have a good process going here, and I'm pleased to be a part of it. You'll recall that I made a presentation at the previous workshop where I talked about Longfin Smelt in relation to the low salinity zone, their status, and the effects of outflow and X2 position. And today I'm going to move upstream a ways and talk about smelt entrainment. And I have 10 slides. It'll take me about 15 minutes, and hopefully I can cover these topics here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the specific vulnerabilities that the two species have to entrainment based on their life history and the operations of the projects. I want to talk about a particular vulnerability that longfin smelt have related to where they are in dry years and their abundance in those years. I want to talk about the relationship between X2 and OMR and also turbidity in entrainment. And I wanted to point out to you and to your staff two great documents that have a lot of information synthesized in them about entrainment. That would be the 2008 biological opinion that the Fish and Wildlife Service wrote, and our effects analysis for the incidental take permit we have for longfin smelt. I'm going to take a stab at trying to make a point about how changes in the estuary can change our perspective on how important entrainment is. I want to try to make the point that entrainment can be consequential. And finally, I'm going to try to point out some areas in the current plan where protection could be improved by comparing it to some other protection schemes that are now in place. So with that, before I talk about fish, I want to talk a little bit about entrainment, because I think there's some confusion on these things. We don't measure, generally speaking, entrainment where it happens. Take the State Water Project, for example. Entrainment takes place at the radial gates outside Clifton Court Forebay. And we don't see those fish, hopefully, until they're salvaged. And so in between those 2 points, you have a significant amount of pre-screen loss, the data tells us. Not all fish that make it across the forebay are screened effectively. So you have variable rates there depending on the size of the fish and the species and so forth. And I would argue that larvae are essentially not counted. You know, there are efforts to estimate them through models and so forth, but to a large extent, we just don't know how many larvae are entrained for the smelt, excuse me. I also want to make a quick point that entrainment and salvage are not the same thing, and that's obvious from the point above. But the two get confused sometimes in conversation. And it's always good to know what you're talking about when you're talking about this. They aren't the same, and the relationship between them changes. So it's good to know what you're talking about there. I also wanted to make the point that entrainment and salvage are both estimated, and I think there's a perception that salvage, we know that number, that's a solid number, and it doesn't have error bars around it, and that's not the case. Salvage is also estimated. It's based on subsampling of the salvaged fish and the water coming in to the system, and so you have an estimate of salvage. And then oftentimes entrainment is estimated based on, basically back calculated based on coefficients that have a lot of uncertainty in them. So this is all good stuff to keep in mind when you're looking at reports and you're looking at proposals for alternative protection measures and that sort of thing. So this slide was just put in here quickly to illustrate this point about longfin smelt having a particular vulnerability in dry years. If you look at the graph there, what you see is a black jagged line in the background, and then blue and red bars representing State Water Project and CVP salvage respectively. So therefore, there I used the word salvage, talking about entrainment. But anyway, so you can see in some of the drier periods, you get a lot of salvage of longfin smelt. And the problem with this fundamentally is that dry years, as you'll remember from my talk last time, are when the recruitment is poorest. So it's kind of a kicking them when they're down situation to keep in mind. And here is a point, illustrating a point about the relationship between X2 position and longfin smelt entrainment. You know, longfin smelt, I think as we understand it, make quick runs out of the low salinity zone into fresh water for spawning. You know, if the low salinity zone is further upstream, they're making that run into closer proximity to the water projects perhaps, and you get higher levels of salvage with higher X2. Just want to make a few points here about delta smelt entrainment. First of all, that the spawning adults, larvae, and early juveniles all have significant vulnerability to entrainment. The spawning adults move into fresh water to spawn, and of course then the larvae and early juveniles are in that habitat in closer proximity to the water project export facilities. The only life stage that's really not that vulnerable is the older juveniles, which tend to be further downstream in cooler water, so we tend not to see as many of those. As with the longfin smelt, you know, in drier winter and spring conditions, there tends to be greater vulnerability because they're further upstream, closer to the facilities. It's been found, I think, pretty reliably that X2 and old middle river flows can be predictive of delta smelt entrainment, and that turbidity plays a role in this as well. Adult spawning smelt tend to be found in turbid water, and if turbid water finds its way into South Delta, they're likely to be entrained in higher numbers. So here's just a graph out of the 2008 biological opinion showing the relationship between OMR and salvage. You know, on the x-axis there you have OMR ranging from 4,000 on the left-hand side to minus 10,000 on the right-hand side, and you can kind of see a geometric progression in salvage rates with increasingly negative OMR flows. So now I'm going to try to make a point about our perspective on entrainment and how it can change, and I may fail at this, but I'm going to give it a try. So, so this graph here is the occurrence of delta smelt. These would be juvenile delta smelt in June, July, that time period. The occurrence of those fish in the summer tow net survey, and in 3 different areas of the delta: the upper Sassoon Bay area, around the confluence of the 2 rivers, and in the San Joaquin area. For this purposes, is kind of the lower San Joaquin in the upper part of the South Delta. And by the way, this is from a report that Matt wrote, but so anyway. But the triangles are, what the triangles show there is the abundance in the San Joaquin area. And as you can see in the early late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a fair number of smelt in that region. And over the 10 or 15 years, they disappeared. And my point here is that this kind of change, you know, could easily change your perspective on entrainment. I dropped in this figure, which is showing the trend in OMR over that period of time that smelt were disappearing from the South Delta. And I'm not suggesting here that the OMR caused it, but I might sometime. But anyway, if you're sampling at points in time where OMR is increasing and the smelt are decreasing, it seems like that would mess up your perspective on how important entrainment is. And these kind of changes take place a lot in the system. And I think it's good to keep them in mind when you're trying to figure out conceptualize about the importance of entrainment. So I have some issues here, or topics that I think are important to consider when you're thinking about the effect of entrainment on populations. Unfortunately, all 6 of these things are probably justify a full-day workshop. So I'm not going to go there, obviously. But I just wanted to go over them real quick. And the first 2 bullets there are really just to suggest that there are occasionally natural experiments in the Delta where you might learn something about the effect of entrainment on populations. We had one this year where we had good OMR conditions early in the season. And then a little later in the season, we were entraining large numbers of, we were salvaging large numbers of juvenile longfin smelt. And it seemed pretty clear to us that we wouldn't have seen those if we hadn't had the good OMR conditions earlier in the season. So to me, that's a population effect of favorable OMR. Wanted to just make a quick point that, you know, people, of course, they rightfully try to use statistics and modeling to find out the effect of entrainment on populations. They should obviously do that. But I just wanted to make the point that it's hard. That you have factors that are driving the populations, like maybe X2 with delta smelt, or spring outflow with longfin smelt, and those can really swamp trying to see other variables. And I talked about the shifting trends in distribution and abundance that make the analysis difficult. Entrainment can also be episodic, so you can get a big entrainment event with a possible population effect, but it just happens suddenly and maybe doesn't happen next year, and it can be an unusual circumstance. And then I also already talked about how it's just difficult to estimate entrainment, so that makes it hard to model it and so forth. So another thing that you have to consider when you're thinking about population effects is the role of density dependence, and the assumptions you make about that can really drive the result. And so it's really, you have to think about this assumption and what you want to do with it in the process. The next thing is more of an opinion than anything else, and just that if you have a rare species, a listed species, and you have a source of direct loss, it seems like ignoring that is problematic, even if the population effect is not proven to be great. And I wanted to also make people aware of an interesting debate in the literature between Wim Kimmerer and B.J. Miller recently about proportional entrainment. I bring it up because it's a difficult to understand debate, but if you give it a try, you'll learn a lot about the concepts behind it.
Could I interrupt you real quickly with a question, or just to clarify, because previous panelists discussed OMR flows as potentially not being important for juvenile salmonids. Your point in this presentation is distinct with respect to OMR flows and their potential impact on the smelt species. Am I characterizing that correctly, or do you take issue with the previous discussion about OMR flows and juvenile
I'm not
salmon?
disagreeing with them about what they said, because they're not the same fish.
Mm-hmm.
You know, juvenile smelt are pelagic in nature. They're just floating around out there, if you will. And so there's very different, and so they're not inconsistent ideas. But I am saying that, yes. And I think that's what the evidence shows. So I'm not going to go through every box of this. This is my last slide. I'm not going to go through every box of it. What we tried to do here is highlight some of the features of the protective schemes that are in place under our incidental tech permit and the biological opinion relating to OMR, and the fact that there's monitoring to give real-time meaning to the actions that are being taken. And then there's this decision-making process for appropriate consideration of the information before action's taken. And those things, as far as I can tell, are not really embodied in the 2006 plan, and are areas where you may want to consider adding some protection. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Good morning, board members and board staff. I'm going to speak today on primarily salmonids, and I have my colleagues Roger Ganay and Matt Nabriga here to help me answer any questions you may have. Okay, this is just my general outline of my talk today. I've seen these questions before. These were the questions that were in your notice about what you were asking for in this workshop, and I'm going to cover, my presentation is going to cover and try to give you some answers to these types of questions, and I will include some key points from some previous submittals that we've put into the process as well. So first, I just want to go, one of the first questions was what new information is available that the board can use to revise the 2006 Bay Delta plan. And I just highlighted some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to go over the status of the stocks, just generally. Fish and Game's already done that generally. I'm going to show some juvenile abundance indices at Chips Island and how they're related to flow. And also provide some information on some genetic information from winter run and spring run of when they're in the Delta in Sacramento and Chips Island. And there's also some new information from genetic analysis from sampling at the fish facilities. And then I'll talk a little bit about some survival information from the San Joaquin Delta and Basin about specifically the 2010 VAMP studies that provided some new information, and include some previous information on the benefits of the head of Old River, the physical head of Old River barrier, and from our perspective, the importance of continuing to monitor survival through the Delta, and also some information on increasing the Delta cross-channel gate closures, as Fish and Game has already mentioned. Okay, this is just a quick slide of the status of the stocks. I have 4 graphs up on the right-hand side there: fall, late fall, winter, and spring. The green lines are the doubling goals, and as Fish and Game has mentioned, that we're not meeting the doubling goals, and the indicators that we have demonstrate there's a continued decline in the salmonid populations, and that we need more protection to meet the water quality control plan's narrative salmon doubling goal. So here's some updated information on juvenile salmon abundance indices at Chips Island. So this is for juvenile salmon that are leaving the Delta. The top graph and the bottom graph are the same graphs. The bottom graph is just breaking down the information into different time periods. It's catch per cubic meter on the y-axis and Rio Vista flows on the x-axis, and it just shows that increased abundance is observed as flows increase for all the 3 time periods. And one exception for the most recent time period from 2007 to 2011, as Kevin mentioned, there's a constant fractional marking program now that's marking 25% of the fall run hatchery production. And so the indices from 2007 to 2011 are less in this graph because we don't incorporate the mark fish into it. So it would have 25% less hatchery fish in that, those estimates between 2006 and 2011. There's also some new information on the temporal distribution of winter run and spring run salmon in the Delta based on genetic analysis. The upper graph is for genetic samples that we're taking from catch at Sacramento in the midwater and Kodiak trawls there in the years 2010 to 2011. And you can see the winter run is in the yellow, and they're entering the Delta in this late October, early November period, and leaving and entering all the way until the March and April period, and then leaving the Delta through at Chips Island in November through April. But the point is that this information is available now and can be used to help determine the timing of when protective actions might be needed for these particular races. So I want to talk a little bit about the recent results from the 2010 VAMP studies. There's also other juvenile salmon survival studies that were conducted on the Stanislaus in 2012 that has some new information available. And there will be some results coming from the 2011 and 2012 South Delta studies that will also be potentially useful for helping revising the 2006 Bay Delta plan. So in 2010, the VAMP study estimated survival from Mossdale. Let's see. Can't tell if there's a pointer here. Nope. No. Okay, well, I'll just point it out. And the circle down on the right, my right, is Mossdale down, and so we're measuring survival from Mossdale to Chips Island. The fish were actually released at Durham Ferry, which is approximately 11 to 12 miles upstream of Mossdale, as well as Stockton and in Old River for this study. So these are the results of the study. The black line on the bottom that cuts across the whole graph is the survival estimate in 2010. It was 5%. And this compares to an average estimate of 16% of the other estimates from 1994 to 2006. The estimates in 2010 were derived using acoustic tagged fish. The estimates from 94 to 2006 were estimated using Kudawar tag fish. And the point I guess I want to try to make with this graph is that the 2010 estimates of 5% survival through the delta is pretty low, even relative to past estimates, and is consistent with the decline since the mid to late 90s. And the barrier, the physical barrier, the years with the physical barrier in place are noted at the top, and in 2010 there was a non-physical barrier in place. So I just want to mention to you that there's been some benefits associated with physical head of Old River barrier. This is just a picture of what the barrier configuration looked like in 2001. You can see the San Joaquin River, and then Old River, and then the physical rock barrier with culverts in it. I just want to mention that I think we believe that there's potential of using the barrier while still being protective of delta smelt. Okay, so this is a graph with the barrier, the physical barrier, head of Old River barrier in place during the VAMP studies that showed that survival between Durham Ferry or Mossdale and Jersey Point was related to flow, seemed to increase as flows increased. And it appears that in 2010 that the survival was not as high as it would have been at flows at Vernalis of 5,000 CFS, as if it would have been when there had been a physical barrier in place. Now we did note that there's a decline since the mid-1990s, so it's hard to say whether this is all essentially just related to the non-physical barrier versus the physical barrier, given that there's been a decline, overall decline over time. So this is just a graph.
And on these studies you've done, they kind of transcend a period of time where the improvement in the coated wire technology has gone from the dark ages to something that appears to function. Could the difference in the quality of your telemetry have made any difference in these studies?
Well, I think they have made. I think the biggest thing is difference is that the acoustic telemetry allows you to get greater precision because you're recovering, detecting more of the fish.
So the lack of that precision could have potentially affected the quality of your earlier data?
It could have, yes. I did provide the standard errors in the previous graph to show you what kind of, and in the years when we measured VAMP, actually the standard errors were relatively low. But I guess
my
one
question gets to the quality of the data you have. I mean,
right. And I guess the acoustic technology has a lot of promise, but it's not without its limitations, I guess. And one of the